Welcome back to Things You Don't Know. I'm Chandler, and today I'm here with my resident historian, Dr. Sean Deneen, and our resident psychologist and musician, Dr. William Weaver.
Well, thanks for the intro, Chandler, and for bringing your insights.
As well as the perspective of your younger generation into play.
Well, anytime, guys, I'm glad to be able to do it. Now, today we're tackling a question that shows up in a lot of religions in one form or another. Is there a final great deceiver, a false savior, a leader, teacher, or a force of evil that presents itself as good?
And that part is very important. In many religious traditions, evil is not always pictured as arriving with a sign that says, I am evil. Quite often, the danger is that evil comes disguised as truth, justice, salvation, wisdom, order, or even holiness.
That is one of the strongest common threads. The details vary a great deal from religion to religion. The names change, the story changes, the theology certainly changes, but in several cases, the warning is similar. People are the most vulnerable when falsehood looks righteous.
Now, Dr. Deneen, that really is the heart of it, isn't it? Not just evil as open brutality, but evil as imitation, evil borrowing a language of goodness.
Exactly, Chandler. That's why it's so terrifying. That is why these traditions remain so compelling. The warning is not merely beware the openly wicked. That's easy enough to say. The deeper warning is beware what flatters your hopes, calms your fears, and asks for trust while quietly corrupting the good.
And that is why this topic matters beyond theology alone, even for people listening simply out of historical or cultural interest. These are traditions asking a serious question. How do human beings tell the difference between what is truly good and what only performs goodness on the surface?
So today, we're comparing four major traditions that we've mentioned before and see our Candles podcast to learn more about what we talked about there. Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism. And we should say right up front here, these are not all exact matches, but they are identical and similar in a lot of ways.
That's right, Chandler. Christianity has the clearest Antichrist type language. Islam has the closest near equivalent in Al Dajjara. Judaism has in time enemies and in later legend a more Antichrist like figure. Buddhism is different, and we will mention some others too. It does not really center on a central or single Antichrist figure, but it does warn of spiritual decline, deception, and the corruption of truth.
So, ladies and gentlemen, instead of forcing all four into the same mold, we're going to ask the same questions of each faith. What is the threat? How does it arise? What impact is predicted? What signs are people told to watch for? And how does the deception work?
Now, that last question, the how does deception work? Now, that may be the most important one, Dr. Deneen. Not just who the villain is, but how the villain works, how the villain persuades people.
Well said. Because persuasion, imitation, and counterfeit virtue are at the center of all this. Although we will focus in this episode on specific religious groups, the concepts are also presented by many other thinkers with warnings about failed attempts by people like Hitler amid warnings concerning those who surround themselves with sycophants. In 2025, tech entrepreneur and commentator Peter Thief reportedly gave lectures about the Antichrist, describing this figure as a dangerous ruler or tyrant tied to worldwide crises and upheaval. In this interpretation, the Antichrist is presented as an anti-Messiah or as part of evil forces influencing areas such as technology and environmental ideology.
Now, Dr. Weaver, I would like to go into and take a look at some key traits to look out for, some key traits that are often associated with this Antichrist figure. Now, these can include misleading charm. The person can come across as appealing, convincing, and even trustworthy, while actually being deeply, deeply deceptive. And this is all done under the guise of strength, while usually just having a weakness of a bully. Another one to look out for, the second one, promises of peace and global unity. He may gain influence by offering order, by offering harmony or international unity. The third one, he will try to seize control through technology and economics. He's often portrayed as using power over buying, selling, communication, or surveillance, sometimes connected to ideas like the mark of the beast. Another one is opposition to truth. He rejects traditional, especially Christian teachings, and may even claim divine status or authority, often doing so while in general, not specific words, claiming to represent Christian or righteous values. Much of the process was actually laid out in Hitler's Mein Kampf. Now, Dr. Weaver, would you start us off with Christianity?
Glad to. In Christianity, the Antichrist is usually understood as a great opponent of Christ and of truth. But Christian teaching is a little more layered than people sometimes realize. In the New Testament, the letters of John speak not only of a coming Antichrist, but also of many antichrists. That means the danger is both future and recurring. It can refer to one climactic deceiver, but it can also refer to a type of falsehood that appears again and again.
And Dr. Weaver, that distinction is certainly worth slowing down for, because a lot of people hear the word Antichrist and think only of one final dramatic figure. But the Christian texts also suggest a repeating pattern.
Yes, that's correct. And that pattern matters because it means Christians are not only told to fear some future monster, they are also told to recognize deception in the present. False teachers, false doctrines, counterfeit spirituality, or some sort of bland frosting of spirituality, and leaders who claim moral or divine authority while undermining truth and justice.
So, already, before we even start talking about end time speculation, Christianity is warning us that antichrists can work as a kind of pattern of corruption.
Yes, a pattern, a spirit, a mode of opposition. Then later Christian tradition often connects this with the man of lawlessness, a figure who exalts himself, deceives many, and may try to perform signs or say that signs are divine.
And Chandler, that brings us right back to the theme we opened with. The real danger is not merely that evil shows up and blatantly announces itself. The real danger is that evil imitates and corrupts the sacred.
And another thing I would like to add here, Dr. Weaver, is that the Christian Antichrist is not just evil in a blunt or obvious way. He often appears quite convincing, too.
Oh, yes. In Christian thought, the real danger is not just cruelty, it is counterfeit goodness. The Antichrist, or the spirit associated with Antichrist, presents falsehood as truth and rebellion as enlightenment.
That, Dr. Weaver, is one of the most important themes in Christian apocalyptic thought. Evil does not simply march in wearing Star Wars like black armor. It often comes dressed in religious language, moral certainty, seductive promises of peace, or claims to a special revelation.
Now, that phrase that you said there, Dr. Deneen, dressed in religious language, now that really hits the nail on the head. The threat is not only the force, it is seduction.
Yes, seduction of the mind, the conscience, and the soul.
Yes. So if a Christian were asking, what sign would I watch for? Then what would you say? What advice would you give them, Dr. Weaver?
I would say watch for deception that appeals to pride, power, fear, and confusion. Watch for false teachings that twist what is good. Watch for leaders who present themselves as protectors of righteousness while demanding ultimate loyalty for themselves. They surround themselves with sycophants. They try and make the rest of the population sycophantal. Watch for pressure to abandon truth for convenience, safety, or social approval. Watch for the blending of saying they performed amazing things or false miracles, false confidence, and false moral superiority.
And perhaps also watch for imitation that is just close enough to the real thing to fool people. That seems to be a part of the Christian warning, too. Not a total rejection of the good, but a dangerous distortion.
Yes, very much so. Some of the most dangerous deceptions are not crude inversions, they are near counterfeits.
Oh, so like forgery, right, Dr. Weaver?
Exactly. A bad forgery fools no one. A skillful forgery is what causes damage.
And the predicted impact is serious: spiritual confusion, large scale persecution, division, a falling away from truth. Some traditions emphasize global turmoil, others focus more on the corruption of faith itself. But the broad Christian warning is that before final redemption, many people may be drawn toward a counterfeit version of the good.
Now, that counterfeit part is quite striking. The idea is not merely that evil wins people by force, it's that evil wins followers by pretending to be good, by pretending to be the answer.
Well put, Chandler. That is one of Christianity's deepest end time warnings.
And it's also one reason Christian discussions of discernment are so important. The question becomes, how do you recognize false light? Chandler, now we're going to look at another tradition, so would you move us over to Islam? Because this is where we find the closest parallel.
I would be glad to do that for us, Dr. Deneen. Now, how does Islam describe this? How do they view this figure?
In Islam, the closest parallel to the Christian Antichrist, al-Dajjal, usually translated in Arabic as the Deceiver. And that title tells you a great deal right away. The central threat is deception. Dajjal is not merely a wicked ruler, He is a false figure whose power lies in his ability to mislead people during a period of crisis just before the end.
And once again, notice the pattern. The danger is not just violence, it is misdirection. Dajjal represents a test so powerful that many people are said to be taken in by appearances. He can present falsehood as truth and be self aggrandizing. He can make himself seem greater than he really is.
Oh, yeah. And that sounds very close to the Christian concern with counterfeit holiness, just with different theological details, Dr. Weaver.
Yes, Chandler, that's a very fair comparison. The traditions are not identical, but the overlap is strong. Dajjal is associated with false claims and spiritual confusion. The warning is that many will be dazzled or misled. He becomes a kind of false authority at a time when people are especially vulnerable.
Yes, and that vulnerability matters. In many end time traditions, people do not embrace deception because they suddenly love evil. No, 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 no. What happens is the deceiver causes such disruption and confusion and presents themselves as the strong person that can correct it all, that people embrace the deception because they are frightened, destabilized, desperate, or spiritually unprepared.
And Dr. Weaver, I want to elaborate on that because that is such an important point that you just made. The danger comes at a moment when people are hungry for certainty.
Yes,
Wow, that sure hits home, doesn't it?
yes. Hungry for certainty, relief,
Yes.
rescue, order, and that is often when deception becomes most persuasive.
In, in Islam, Dajjal's appearance is part of a broader period of upheaval and testing.
Now, what impacts are predicted in Islamic teaching, Dr. Deneen?
Well, it's very similar to Christianity, a severe trial of faith, religious confusion, and social turmoil, a great sorting out of who remains steadfast and who gives way to deception. Islamic tradition also places Dajjal among other end time disturbances, including major conflict and the release of destructive worldwide forces like Gog and Magog, known in Arabic as Yajul and Majul.
So again, deception is not happening in a calm, stable environment. It appears amid crisis.
Yes, it does. And what signs would Muslims traditionally look for?
The key sign is the rise of overwhelming deception at a moment of instability. People are warned against being taken in by outward claims, appearances, or displays of power. In practical moral terms, the warning is not unlike Christianity's. Do not mistake spectacle for truth, and do not mistake confidence for righteousness.
And that point travels well beyond religion. Human beings are often tempted to think power proves truth. These traditions push back against that assumption.
So, if someone appears commanding, miraculous, persuasive, and certain, that in itself really does not prove that he is good.
Quite the opposite. In these traditions, extraordinary claims and displays may be reasons for greater caution, not less.
And just as in Christianity, the story ends not with deception triumphing forever, but with divine victory. Evil may appear persuasive for a time, but it does not have the final word.
So, in both Christianity and Islam, the one shared idea is this: the end time enemy is not only wicked, he is persuasive also.
Yes. persuasive, misleading, and dangerous precisely because he presents himself as more than he really is.
Or to put it another way, he exploits the human desire to believe that rescue has arrived.
Now, Dr. Deneen, let's get into Judaism real carefully. How should we approach Judaism here without oversimplifying it?
Very carefully, Chandler. Judaism does not have one universally agreed antichrist, anti Messiah figure in the same way many Christians imagine one. But Judaism absolutely does have traditions of end time enemies, final conflict, persecution, and suffering before redemption.
So the broad comparison is real, but it is not exact.
You're correct, Dr. Weaver. Two important strands are worth noting. First, there is Gog and Magog, hostile military forces tied to a final conflict. Second, in later Jewish legend, there is Armilius, who is much more like an anti messianic figure, a false or hostile end time ruler who opposes God's people.
So, Armulus is the closest thing to a Jewish version of the Antichrist.
In later legend, yes, that is the closest comparison. But we should be honest, it is not as central across Judaism as the Antichrist is in many Christian teaching or as the Gile is in Islamic eschatology.
Still, there is an important shared theme in Jewish apocalyptic thinking. The threat is often not only brute force, but also oppressive power that stands against God's purposes while presenting itself as legitimate, victorious, or inevitable.
Whoa, inevitable. Interesting word choice there, Dr. Weaver.
Yes, because evil does not always ask to be loved. Sometimes it only asks to be accepted as unavoidable.
Thank you, Dr. Weaver and Chandler, both of you. That is very well said. There may not always be false goodness in quite the same way as Christianity or Islam describe it, but it is still evil cloaked in authority.
Yes, it is, and that is a powerful phrase. Evil cloaked in authority.
And Chandler, it fits. In many end time scenarios, the enemy is not merely some random villain. It is a hostile power rising in a way that looks dominant, lawful, and even unstoppable. For believers, the temptation is to assume that visible power must be rightful power.
Yeah, but these traditions warn against that assumption. A regime, ruler, or movement may look ordered, impressive, and victorious while still being opposed to what is good.
Yes, so the deception here may be less, I am your savior, and maybe more of, I am history, I am order, I am the winning side.
Yes, exactly. Sometimes evil presents itself as masqueraded holiness. Sometimes it presents itself as necessity, and sometimes it presents itself as destiny.
And all three can be persuasive.
So, what impacts are predicted in Jewish tradition, Dr. Deneen?
Conflict, oppression, suffering, and deep crisis before deliverance. The coming of redemption is often preceded by a period of great strain, sometimes called the birth pangs of the Messianic age. The focus is less on one perfect counterfeit Savior and more on severe trial, hostile nations, persecution, and eventual divine vindication.
Well, now, in a way, Dr. Deneen, if I must say, that seems more political and more communal in tone.
Oh, often, yes. Although, of course, religion, politics, and peoplehood are deeply intertwined in much Jewish history and thought. The point here is that the emphasis tends to fall more heavily on conflict, oppression, and endurance.
And what signs would someone in that tradition be watching for? Well, escalating conflict, corruption, arrogance of power, suffering among the faithful, and the sense that the world is passing through a final, painful struggle before restoration. The deception here may not always be one charismatic false messiah. It may be the broader illusion that oppressive power is somehow morally justified.
And Dr. Weaver, that is a very relevant distinction. Sometimes evil pretends to be holy, sometimes it pretends to be necessary, sometimes it pretends to be history's inevitable winner.
And that may be just as dangerous because if people believe something is inevitable, then they may stop resisting it. Hence the word inevitable. That's exactly what the word means.
Precisely. Now let's turn ourselves to Buddhism. How about it, Chandler?
Let's do that, Dr. Weaver. Now, for the hardest comparison Buddhism. Now, what do you
Yes.
have to say about that?
Well, yes. And this is where we need real precision. Buddhism does not usually teach a single Antichrist like end time ruler. So we should not pretend that it does.
No, but it does have parallels in terms of deception, decline, and the corruption of truth.
Exactly. In Buddhism, one major figure is Mara, who represents temptation, delusion, obstruction, and the forces that keep beings trapped in ignorance. Mara is not simply the Buddhist devil in an easy one for one sense, but he does embody spiritual opposition and deception.
So, already, even if there is no exact Antichrist figure, there is still a concern with false perception.
Yes, and that may be the key bridge for comparison. In Buddhism, deception is often less about allegiance to a final evil ruler and more about beings becoming trapped in illusion, desire, ignorance, and corrupted understanding.
And there is also the idea of the Dharma declining over time, right?
Yes, that is probably the more important parallel for our purposes. Buddhism teaches in many traditions that the Dharma, in other words, the true teaching, declines over time. Understanding weakens, discipline weakens, practice weakens, confusion grows, and eventually the future Buddha, Maitreya, comes in a distant age when the teaching must be renewed.
Yes, so the danger in Buddhism is usually not a single false savior taking over the world. No, it's a world drifting farther from truth, farther away from discipline, and farther from enlightenment.
Yes, Jana, and that makes it less dramatic in one sense, but perhaps more pervasive in another. The corruption is woven into an entire age.
That's a good way to put it.
Yes, it is, but I also still think that we could say that there's a parallel here in the sense that error can be posed as wisdom, it can pretend to be wisdom.
Yes, that's a fair way to put it. In Buddhism, the danger is often delusion posing as insight, attachment posing as freedom, and corruption of teaching presenting itself as genuine understanding.
So once again, we have the issue of imitation. This time, not a false Christ, not exactly a false Messiah, but false understanding wearing the appearance of enlightenment.
Ooh, you know, Dr. Deneen, that may be the most Buddhist version of the pattern that we're tracing here.
I think that's right. The false appearance matters here too, even if the story is not centered on one final evil king or false messiah.
That makes Buddhism the least direct comparison, but not an irrelevant one. The common idea is that truth can be obscured. People can mistake illusion for reality, and spiritual life can be hollowed out before renewal comes.
So, what signs would Buddhism emphasize here?
Moral decline, weakening discipline, confused teaching, increased greed, hatred, and delusion, more division, a world in which people are less capable of seeing clearly. The threat is less follow the false God man and more be swept into a degraded age where truth becomes difficult to imagine or recognize.
And that too fits our broader theme. Evil or spiritual error of all kind does not always arrive as open wickedness. Sometimes it arrives as confusion. It slowly makes people unable to tell truth from imitation.
Which can be even harder to fight because people may not notice the drift until it has gone very far, and unfortunately, in some cases, too far.
Yes, corruption is not always explosive. Sometimes it is gradual. Now, before we move forward, we should mention a few other major religions' positions on the Antichrist types. Maybe
Okay,
you can help us here, Dr. Deneen.
I'd be glad to. Let's look at Hinduism first. The closest parallel is the Kali Yuga, a degenerate age of moral decline, where Kalki appears at the end to destroy the wicked and renew the age. That is more Dark Age plus Final Restorer than one false Messiah. Wicca generally has no Antichrist like figure. Wicca centers the goddess and the horn god, and Wiccan sources explicitly reject Satan or devil worship as part of their tradition. Scientology. Scientology talks about good and evil in terms of constructive versus destructive action and says humans are basically good, but it does not center on a single end times deceiver like an antichrist.
Now, I want to get to a point here that I've been wanting to talk about, and I think it's the main point, the main basis of this whole entire thing. The shared pattern, evil that's wearing the face of good. This is found in all of these. Now, let me try to bring all of these together, and you guys tell me if I'm being fair here, okay?
Go right ahead, Chandler.
In Christianity, the Antichrist is tied to false teaching, deception, and counterfeit holiness. Evil pretends to be righteous. In Islam, Al Dajjal is the great deceiver. Evil misleads people by presenting false authority and false greatness. In Judaism, the emphasis is more on hostile powers and end time oppression, and in some later tradition, an anti messianic enemy. Evil often appears clothed in power, legitimacy, and dominance. And in Buddhism, there is no real direct antichrist, but there is spiritual corruption, delusion, and the decline of true teaching, and the danger of mistaking illusion for wisdom. So they all basically have the same pattern thought process.
They do. Chandler, that's very well put.
Yes, and notice how strong the shared lesson is. The danger is not always obvious wickedness, it is misrecognized wickedness. Evil that is admired, evil that is trusted, evil that speaks the language of good.
Now, when you say misrecognized wickedness, now that really lands because it suggests that the problem is not only what evil is, but how people misread it.
Exactly. And that is why discernment becomes so central in all these traditions, even when the theology differs. If evil was always grotesque on first sight, the warning would hardly be necessary.
Or to say it more simply, The worst lies often sound morally serious. The most dangerous deceivers often appear confident, disciplined, or even noble. That is why so many traditions stress discernment.
And that might be the most unsettling part of all of this.
It certainly is, because it means the faithful are not only warned against cruelty and violence, they are also warned against seduction, confusion, imitation, and counterfeit virtue.
Yeah, confusion. And yes, you're right. And perhaps also against desperation. People in fear may cling to a false rescuer because they want relief so badly.
Oh, yes, Dr. Weaver. So deception feeds not only on ignorance, but on longing.
Yes, on longing, fear, exhaustion,
That's where the sycophants come in.
and pride. And that is where the sycophants come in, yes.
Which is one reason why these stories remain so powerful. They are not only about the end of time, they are also about the vulnerabilities of the human heart.
Now, before we wrap up, gentlemen, I would like for all three of us to give a plain spoken summary. Now, if someone were to ask, what signs do these traditions point to? What would we say to them?
Well, for Christianities, I would say watch for falsehood dressed up as truth. Watch for leaders or movements that demand ultimate loyalty, twist morality, imitate holiness, or present themselves as the answer while leading people away from what is generally good.
For Islam, I would say beware overwhelming deception in a time of instability. Beware false claims to authority, greatness, or spiritual rightness. The warning is that people under pressure can be taken in by appearances.
Well, for Judaism, I would say look for arrogant and hostile power, oppression, turmoil, and the temptation to believe that dominant force must also be rightful force. That's not always true. And the test here is whether or not people remain faithful when power turns against what is holy.
And for Buddhism, I would say watch for a decline in clarity, discipline, compassion, and truth. Watch for a world where confusion becomes normal, where crisis after crisis just throw themselves down at us, and where people mistake delusion, desire, and false teaching for wisdom.
And in all four traditions, in different ways, the same warning appears: do not judge by appearance alone.
Do not assume that what is loud is true, and do not assume that what is powerful is right, and also don't assume that what appears sacred is really sacred.
Exactly.
And maybe one more thing should be said. These traditions do not merely encourage suspicion of everyone and everything, they encourage discernment. That is different. Discernment is not paranoia, it is careful moral and spiritual judgment.
Now, Dr. Deneen, that is a very important distinction there. Otherwise, the listener might walk away thinking that the lesson is simply trust no one. And that's not what we're trying to say here.
That's correct. The deeper lesson is not trust no one. It is do not surrender judgment to saber rattling or appearances.
And do not confuse charisma with truth, dominance with justice, or reassurance with goodness.
Now, that's a strong statement there, Dr. Deneen.
So, to sum everything up, do other religions have parallels with the Christian idea of the Antichrist?
Yes, but with very important differences.
Christianity gives us the Antichrist. Islam gives us El Dajjal, the Great Deceiver. Judaism gives us end-time enemies, and in later legends, a more anti-messianic persecutor. Buddhism gives us a different kind of warning. Not one final Antichrist, but an age of decline in which delusion and corruption spread.
And in all of them, in one way or another, warn against that the gravest danger is not always evil in its ugliest form.
No, it's not. Sometimes it's evil, smiling, blessing, promising, reassuring.
And asking to be trusted.
Once again, that's what makes discernment so important.
This has been Things You Don't Know.
Thanks for listening.
Please come back, leave us a like and a comment, and we'll see you soon.